Wilson, Dr. Parsons, Barker, American botanist of the service technique, and M. Aubrey, a middle-aged, handsome, bronze-colored Haitian who had learned mountain climbing in Germany and Switzerland. And now apparently we were all lost together, Ekman included, straggling along behind each other but still within shouting distance, leading our horses, Aubrey and I begging St. Christopher to aid the weary travellers. It was doubtless fortuitous rather than miraculous that 20 minutes later, Ekman shouted back that he had found the chestnut trees. Aubrey and I gave him no credit for it. They were gigantic European chestnut trees, an avenue of them planted 2 centuries ago by some rich colonial whose name is forever lost, leading to the ruins of what must once have been a superb estate, which we examined later by daylight. Had we arrived here 150 years ago, a marquis might have welcomed us, slaves would have tended our horses, wines of old France would have been brought from the cellar for our refreshment, and we would have slept in a chateau amid gardens of roses. The giant chestnut trees, planted in a double row at intervals of some 50 yards, guided us in the darkness along the top of a ridge, and when we came to the last of them, no longer in any footpath, Aubrey began shouting to Ekman, but there was no reply. We sat down, holding our horses' bridles, while Parsons, Barker and Wilson straggled up and joined us. We shouted now in concert, and when still no answer came, began to wonder if Ekman had slid off. 250 trails winding a cliff. Not that goddamned mountain goat, said Wilson. There was nothing to do but wait. After a while, from somewhere forward and down the slope toward the left, came the mocking voice of Ekman, so elose that he scarcely needed to shout, "Vale, you lazy fellows, why don't you come on?" Forward and down we stumbled until we came to plantains and knew we were on the edge of a habitation, then saw a dull glow and arrived, missing the footpath, at Mam and Lucy's kale. Beside a fire in the little compound sat Ekman brewing tea. By the other side of the fire erouched Mam and Lucy, an old crone with her head swathed in cloths, apparently half asleep. Ekman said to her in Creole, "These are the other doctors. Call some of your little world to give a hand with the horses." It seemed the big world. The old man was away. Mam and Lucy, half aroused from her torpor, called, "Amilus tea, son, vin kit by coup," by the red glow of the fire. We saw in the doorway of the mud hovel a wench of 14 or 15 years, apparently stark naked, who stared at us dumbly. High lights on her white eyeballs and her black pointed breasts made her like a figure on a Rembrandt Envers. Hiding behind her, Hud dealing against her, was a still littler world, a boy of 8 or 10. "Vinny done," said Mam and Lucy, "and no need to gain fear," said Ekman, and they came out reluctantly to help us with our saddle gear. The girl, who had a necklace of bones and beads and the inevitable wanga strung round her neck on a cord, totally unconscious of her nudity, was more timidly curious than fearful. The boy, clad in a raggedy-tailed old shirt, was breathless with terror. His hands trembled as he helped unbridle and halter the horses, and when Parsons patted him on the back and asked if he was T-son, he replied out in a shrill falsetto treble like the squeak-ing of an animal, "I do not mean it as a figure of speech that..." Mornellaselle Adventure 251. He was breathless. I mean, he was so frightened he actually couldn't get his breath to utter normal sounds. It turned out that except for Ekman, he had never seen a white face before. When Aubrey snapped on his flashlight, T-son darted back screaming. The girl too leaped as if shot but stood her ground. They helped pile up our gear and showed us where we could tether our horses for the night, among the plantains. The 5 of us who had ridden at least half the long road were too tired to care much about eating, but Ekman, who had walked the whole distance with a heavy knapsack, was devouring a warmed-over mess of millet from the old woman's iron pot. So long as he could get native food, he scorned the elaborate canned stuff we had lugged along in our packs. We squatted in a wide outer circle around the fire and had some of his tea in our canteen tins with a bit of bread. Then we smoked and talked. Close by the fire inside our circle sat Ekman and Mam and Lucy. Presently Amelis, drawn by her curiosity, came and crouched beside the fire to watch us. Ekman, with his belly full of millet, was becoming amiable. "Vale," he said expansively, "it is all right, yes." But when all of us, even including Wilson, agreed that it was quite all right, he couldn't bear the harmony and added, "Juice the same, you veer fools to go on, it vas better we should stop by the chapel." And then he tried to browbeat us all into huddling inside the kale to sleep, because he preferred it to lying beneath the stars. We told him to go to hell and disposed our blankets among the plantains near where the horses were tethered. As Wilson bunked down, he groaned, "What a swine Ekman is, you'll never get me on another trip with him." Aubrey protested, No, Ekman is good, it is just his way, and Barker's voice out of the darkness interrupted. 252 TILS winding, you're a liar, Wilson, you'd go with him again next week. Well, if I would, retorted Wilson sleepily. It just shows what a fool I am. Dawn awakened us, refreshed but sore. We routed out Ekman, who was still snoring. Mam and Lucy made coffee, and we were off. Mam and Lucy's habitation was the highest and last Ekman had touched on his former Morne Larcel adventure. He had taken to the woods, avoiding human contact, because it was said in Port-au-Prince that one obstacle in climbing the peak was that superstitious peasants, believing it a sort of savage Olympus, home of gods and demons, refused to let explorers and travellers pass. However, rumour said that a village existed on the Merion Ridge, across a deep gorge from Camp Frank, and perhaps 1,000 feet higher up. No such village was shown even on the large-scale detail maps. Not even the trails were charted any higher than Camp Frank, but if it did exist, Ekman believed we could find it. Scattered around Camp Frank there were a half-dozen habitations like Mam and Lucy's. None of the dwellers on this ridge had ever crossed the gorge, but they assured us that people of some sort lived above, because at night they sometimes heard the sound of drums. We were as much interested in this, and in putting the rumoured barrier of superstition to a test, as we were in climbing the mountain. Parsons had brought medicines in his saddle bag, the best of all passports, and Ekman, with his unwieldy folio of botanical specimens, was generally considered to be a docteur fuel, leaf-doctoring sorcerer. We descended the gorge by a clearly marked footpath, single file, forced most of the time to lead our horses. When it became certain that this path Merrill wound down the ravine to emerge in a lower valley, we turned back and MORNELASELLE Adventure 253 Ekman presently discovered a fainter trail. He said it was a trail, though we could see nothing, which promised to take us up Merion, and it did. On a small plateau at 6,000 feet we saw smoke and came to cleared fields, planted in Congo peas and millet, even a few plantains, rare at that elevation, with a number of scattered habitations. Oi, oi, cried Ekman, one of his favourite ejaculations, though there wasn't a trace of Hebrew in him. Maybe they will be surprised to see us. As we rode toward the largest of the habitations, men and boys, all with machetes, came running from the fields until a group of 20 or 30 were gathered close round us. They gave us no greeting, which was strange, and refused to respond to our questions, whispering among themselves. They seemed puzzled and worried rather than hostile. Women came to the doors, even out toward the path, and stared at us silently, wide-eyed, but not afraid. Here for the first and only time in Haiti, I saw tattooed faces of men and women. The markings were thus, diversely, on cheeks or forehead. Oh, the first two symbols, I believe, had both a sexual and a serpent significance. The heart-shaped one I cannot guess unless it was intended to represent a heart. The fourth and fifth symbols represented perhaps the triple paths and triple circles through which the voodoo misters move. Fred Baker, who spent many years in the hills and is now engaged in rubber experimentation for the U.S. Department of Agriculture, says these tattoo marks, which are really burns, seen only in the most remote and isolated communities, are made with a caustic from the shell of the cashew nut, Anacardium occidental, and that the heart-shaped mark is the natural outline of the split shell pasted against the cheek. TILS winding 254 except that their clothes were homemade rather than store-bought. They were all dressed like any Haitian peasants and seemed prosperous. At the point where the path passed in front of the largest habitation, the men crowded across it, not barring our progress in a threatening way, but as if it were taken for granted that we must stop there. Still they stared dumbly, refusing to parley. We had all dismounted. Ordinarily, rural etiquette required them to take our bridles. Aubrey, to establish contact, offered his bridle to a youth, who hesitated and turned toward an older man who shook his head. Ekman, impatient, said he had grand soif and demanded water, a request which it was difficult to deny, and which somewhat broke their reserve. There were hurried whispers, and then one said, "Besom, 10 grows, noon." 10 minutes later the Grows Moon, chief of the village, arrived, a tall old man barefoot in overalls and blouse, head swathed in a bandana, sparse, white, pointed beard. We had been prepared to meet suspicion and obstacles, but not for the surprise he gave us. "Where are your papers?" he demanded, and it was our turn to gape and stare. Aubrey asked him to please explain what he meant. "I," said the old man, "am authority. I am General Telimone, chief of section, and in the name of Nord Alexis, President, I demand to see your papers." My friend, said Aubrey, I also am a general, and I salute your authority, but President Nord Alexis, alas, has been dead these 20 years. Our president now is Louis Borno, there is peace in the plains, and a laissez passer is no longer required of travellers. The old man seemed in doubt whether to believe Aubrey or not, and puzzled what he ought to do. It may well be, he said, that Nord Alexis is dead. There have been no travellers here in many years, and we do not go down from Mornelasselle Adventure 255 The Mountain. But who are these white men, and why do you come to my village? Aubrey explained that we were doctors, looking for herbs which grew still higher in the mountains, and that we came asking his friendly hospitality, water, forage and care for our horses, while we went farther on foot. We showed him Ekman's specimens, which carried conviction, the bottles and boxes in Parsons' saddle bag, and offered to treat any sickness in the village. Their suspicion melted, and now they disputed for the privilege of taking our horses and gear, 3 or 4 seizing the same bridle, fighting and tugging over our saddle bags and rolls, so that an untitled cinema flash, had one been taken, would have carried the impression we were being roundly pillaged. Old Authority restored peace, designated individuals to take our horses to water and pasture, ordered all our gear piled up against the wall of his own house, and set his womenfolk to pounding coffee for our refreshment. Then came an episode that increased their friendliness. A cousin of Old Authority lay on a pallet with a dislocated shoulder, badly swollen. Fastened to his arm was a wooden cross, and around his neck a wanga bag of greasy black cloth, the size of a goose egg, filled with myrrh diable, their name for a saffitida, dried pig tree leaves and snake bones. It was an excellent high-smelling wanga, but it hadn't worked. Wilson and Parsons prodded him over and said, "Papa, we are going to throw your shoulder back in place, but it's going to hurt and you're going to howl." They did by main force, to the accompaniment of yells that Mammon Lucy might have heard, way over on the other ridge. Then they gave him a light shot of morphine, and when he went peacefully to sleep, the entire village knew that we were mighty doctors. We had been discussing in English among ourselves. TRAILS winding 256 The advisability of confiding to Old Authority our real objective, the ascent of Morne la Selle, whose black, forbidding slopes rose over yonder behind Merion, disappearing as if they went on up forever among the clouds. Barker, who had been turned back some months before by superstitious peasants who became angry and threatening when he had tried to climb Morne Diable in the north, was in favour of saying simply that we sought plants on the higher slopes of Merion, but the rest of us, now that Old Authority and his people were friendly, felt it would be more interesting to tell him, and if he raised objections, argue it out. So we did tell him, more keen on his reactions than his help, which at a pinch we could get along without. He shook his head vigorously. It was forbidden, he told us, but not by his or any other human authority. On Morne la Selle, as everybody knew, were loup garous and demons. We couldn't go, not because he forbade it, but because we would be killed. There was an old trail, he said, which skirted Morne la Selle some 1,000 feet higher, crossing the Merion Ridge and leading down to Salle Trow. That far we could go, though even there it was dangerous after dark, and that far he would gladly give us guides and carriers. Beyond that there were no trails, at least none made by human feet. Now there was no use whatever to argue with Old Authority that demons and loup garous did not exist. Rather, we pointed out that Dr. Ekman was not merely a docteur Jewel, but a hawker, sorcerer, under the protection of his gods, and that no demon of any sort had power to harm him or those under his protection. At this point, Aubrey had an inspiration. He broke in on the old chief's dubious objections by saying, "Papa, one reads in your face that you have courage, and this is a great adventure. I am a black man like yourself, and I am going because I know that no harm can come to me with this." Mornelasselle Adventure 257 White Hawker. Why not yourself come with us? It will increase your power. It was a splendid idea of Aubrey's, it flattered the old man, it made him as one of us, it made him an ally. His eyes glowed with excitement, and then the excitement died and he said, 10 years ago I believe I would have done it. Now I am too old, but I will provide boys if any can be found who will dare it. Vale, dat is fine," said Ekman and patted him on the back. "In 1 hour we will start, yes. Massilia," shouted Old Authority to one of his wives, "call the major and make sound the drum." A work drum boomed the village assembly call, and 30 or 40 men and boys gathered in Old Authority's compound, where he explained that Ekman was a great bocker. that we were going to the top of the morn where no human being had ever been before, that we guaranteed protection and wanted carriers. Such a whispering and buzzing and wide opening of eyes and general chatter and excitement hadn't been known in the village for a generation. No, 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 came at first from all sides, the women protesting loudest and dragging at the arms of their men and boys. Then one boy not over 13 stepped out. He was pop-eyed with fright, but he blurted, "Moin pr all a p, I am for going." You could see the quick, elementary emotional psychology leap through the crowd at that. Who's he any more than we are? If he's not afraid, we're not. If he goes, we want to go too. Despite superstition, they were a crowd of half-grown children. It was like a game of follow the leader. Here was this village of Baydorks, probably the highest and most isolated group habitation in the entire West Indies, whose people had believed for generations that the black, forbidding, gorge-broken mountain which towered above them and lost itself in the clouds was the abode of demons and sure death. 2J8TILS winding, so that never had the most venturesome, young or old, ever dared set foot on its slopes. And now all of a sudden, because one kinky-headed, pop-eyed, scared kid with his heart in his mouth said, "TM for going," we could have had them all. At that moment, if not later, we could have marched off with the entire youth of the village trailing after us as the rats followed the piper. Each of us chose one, boys ranging from 13 to 16, and we planned to make our start immediately from the village spring, at the head of an adjacent ravine on Merion. Men, women, babies, dogs, and old authority himself followed us there to see the start. This was the last water, and our boys, in addition to carrying our blankets, canteens, tinned food, etc., were each to tote a calabash. At the spring we sat around for a short time, ate a cold snack, filled ourselves and the containers with water, and imagined that we were ready to start. But Ekman, usually in a hurry, sat like a sore toad on a rock. "Well, let's get going," said Wilson briskly, at which Ekman swelled up and sat tighter. "What's the matter?" Wilson asked him as it became plain that something was. "I am waiting," snapped Ekman, "for the elephants and cannons." Parsons caught his meaning instantly and howled with laughter. Ekman, at his cantankerous worst, was a hateful but gifted master of sarcasm, and he couldn't bear tranquility for an entire day. Back in the village, he had apparently acquiesced in the scheme of taking a gang of carriers along. Now he revolted. "Am I Hannibal, that you expect me to lead this army to the top of a mountain? Am I Moses, that I must be followed by tribes? All over these mountains, all over Cuba, I go alone with a machete and a piece of bread. But you, for one little trip, must have an army of carriers and servants. Mornellaselle Adventure 259 who will only hinder us and hold us back. Fifth, this straggling mob we never get there. So let us end this foolishness and send back these boys and start." In our several ways, some of us angry and some amused, we told him to go to hell, that if he wanted to lug his own pack like a donkey, he could do it and be damned, but that as for us, we were going to keep our carriers. Off he started, finally, still grumbling, and carrying his own stuff, we single file after him, followed by our boys with our gear on their heads, so that we looked a bit like Stanley starting into darkest Africa. An hour later, around noon, Ekman, loaded with 30 pounds and cutting through lianas and thorn bushes to open our upward trail, was making better time than we were, unloaded and not having to stop and cut. Even the boys behind us were complaining. Every quarter of a mile or so, he would draw away from us by 100 yards, and then we would climb puffing up to find him seated on a rock, as if he had been there for weeks, sucking an orange or examining some leaves. And the conversation at these stops was eloquent. Ekman, now in his element, was amiable again, but still pretended to grumble, and when Wilson muttered that he thought he could keep up an ordinary decent pace as well as any man, but had never claimed to be able to follow a stinking Piaunton goat, Ekman beamed on him and offered him the quarter of an orange. He was gay because we were suffering, and because he had a final dirty trick up his sleeve that we did not then suspect. Toward 4 o'clock, marching on easier ground through enormous pine trees, on the Merion Ridge, we came at the point where it joined the salient of Morne-la-Selle to an old, faintly marked trail, crossing our path at right angles. It was the highest trail on the Caribbean islands. Ekman guessed that our boys would know of lower, roundabout connecting trails that would take them back even. 260TILS winding tulely to Baydorks, and waiting there until they all came up, he tried deliberately to shake them, to discourage them from going further. He talked to us in rapid Creole, solely for their benefit, describing vague dangers, and saying that we had no right to lead them into them. It was another of the moments when I thoroughly hated Ekman and would have really enjoyed killing him. He'd have got away with it except for one thing. The boys were caught because the sun would set soon now behind high ridges. They were afraid to come on, but they were even more afraid to go back with the certainty of being overtaken by Black Night before they could get out of the shadow of Larcelle and its demons. So they came on, miserable with us. Crossing this trail, we were on Morne Larcelle itself. Our plan was to go up its slope as far as we could before dark, make camp, then start at earliest dawn next day for the final climb of some 3,000 feet, hoping to reach the summit by 9 o'clock, spend only an hour there in observation, and get back to Baydorks the same night. We tried to keep to ridges, but sometimes, in order to hold our general direction, had to lose altitude, descending into gorges and ravines. Toward twilight, we descended into a rocky one, and clambering up its opposite side came to Ekman, who called, "Look at this, Barker. Here is something strange." We were climbing up an eroded limestone escarpment bare of vegetation at an angle sharper than 45 degrees, and there, worn in the rock, he had found an unmistakable footpath, not leading in the direction we were trying to climb, but clinging and winding along the side of the salient, leading up toward the cliffs at the head of the gorge. There was something eerie about it, for there was no rhyme or reason in its being there. "Would it be wild goats then?" said Ekman. "One do not think so." "That you think, Barker?" Mornellaselle Adventure 261. "No, it's a human footpath all right," said Barker. "And it's been here a long time and I believe it is still used, but what for?" Our boys had come up and had seen the path, and their eyes were all but popping out of their heads. If we were puzzled, they were not. It was all too simple to them. No natural feet or hoofs had made that trail, but demons laup garras sans proles. I felt genuinely sorry for them. Their terror was pitiful. The direction of the path indicated that it went up to the head of the gorge, hemmed in by sheer cliffs from which there was no egress. To have followed and explored it, which we discussed, for even Ekman was keenly puzzled, would probably have meant abandoning reaching the summit. Parsons and I voted to do it, but the others, more reasonably perhaps, said we had left Port-au-Prince for a diffy night purpose, and that we should go on. Meantime, Barker had walked along it a short distance alone, and was out of sight behind rocks. Ekman shouted to him that we had decided to go on. He hallooed back and presently returned, saying, "I believe I've found out where it goes. I wish we had time to see. There's a higher ledge up there. It goes up the face of the cliff, and there seems to be a cave." "Yah," jeered Ekman, "and an old man with a white beard in it, sitting looking at a skull." "Well, there might be at that," said Barker. "Somebody still goes up there, and I'd like to know what for." "We can't do it," said Ekman, and I believe he regretted it too. "We've got to go on and make camp." So on we went, climbing out of the ravine, emerging on a plateau where there were huge pine trees, an open forest in rocky soil, trees here and there fallen with rotting trunks and branches. It was almost dark. We were at some 7,000 feet, and even in the tropics it was getting shiveringly cold. At 262 trails winding the same altitude in the temperate zone, we'd have been above the snow line. Wood from the fallen trees, some of which had lain there rotting for generations, was plentiful and easy. Branches as thick as a man's thigh, great hunks of stumps came loose with a little tugging, and working in pairs, we built 3 huge bonfires, forming a 40-foot triangle in the center of which we camped, warm and comfortable, and stuffed ourselves to repletion with tea, bread, and tinned meat. The boys, huddled together as close as they could get to us, were worthless from fear, so, Ekman beginning, we took watches of an hour each, feeding the bonfires and keeping a lookout that they didn't spread, while the others slept. Ekman and Wilson had mutually depended on each other to bring a thermometer, so we had none, but walking outside the triangle of bonfires was like emerging from a kitchen door on a cold November night in New England. We guessed the temperature to be just above freezing. I was awakened in the middle of the night by something alive moving against my feet. It was my boy Dinah who lay there, pressing against them, curled up like a ball, shivering more from terror, I imagine, than from cold. I pushed the bottom of the blanket down over his shoulders, and he squirmed under it against my feet, whimpering his gratitude. Barker, who had the last watch, awakened us an hour before dawn. Night and the mysterious trail on the cliff at twilight had so increased the fear of our boys that they concluded anything was better than following us farther, and announced that as soon as it got light, they were going back down. They decently agreed, however, to carry back our blankets and other gear we had no further use for. We made breakfast of bacon, biscuit, and tea, drank what little water remained, except 4 reserve canteens containing each a pint and a half. One of these, with a big hunk of biscuit and the remains of our cheese and sausage, we tied MORNELASELLE Adventure 263 in a bandana and slung from the limb of a tree, to be picked up on our return. We were to take 3 canteens to the summit, drink them there, and come back down thirsty. Ekman had wisely figured that we were safe in using all our water for the climb. He believed that on the descent, we could make Baydorks before dark. If we got lost, it was his plan to waste no time wandering, but simply keep descending, with the certainty that even if we missed our objective, we should arrive, by following ravines, at a spring of some sort. The first part of the climb was easy going along an open, rocky ridge among enormous pines, but we were forced to lose nearly all the altitude we gained the first hour, scrambling down and up the further side of a barren ravine. The only really dangerous point came as we traversed the stony razorback edge of another ridge, which dropped on one side some 2,000 feet down a sheer cliff, and from which, for the first time, we saw, through a break in the clouds which were both above and below, the slope of what Ekman said was the Morne La Selle Peak. The final hour as hard but not dangerous, clambering among rocks with the big pine trees left behind, no vegetation but occasional stunted pines, moss and clumps of ilex. On the last slope of the summit itself, we came to another old, faint footpath, and followed it because it wound upward. We began to believe it was going to lead us to the top, but within a few hundred yards of the summit, it slid off to the left, so that we abandoned it and kept climbing. The summit itself was undramatic, a round knoll or cone of soft, eroded limestone, on which were half a dozen small pine trees, 3 or 4 century plants and some ilex scrub. Cemented in a rock was the bronze tablet put there by the Geodetic Survey 6 years before. The plaque said, République de Haiti Travaux Publics, Défense d'Abima, etc., but the spaces left for the date and the TILS winding 264 elevation to be chiselled in had for some reason been left blank. There, close by, lay the rotting tin can containing the hardened remains of the Portland cement which had been used to affix the plaque, and beside it a proportionately rotted sardine tin, with partly legible lettering which we guessed was Seacoast Canning Company, Eastport, Maine, plainly a relic of the same expedition. The clouds were all about us. There was no view. We occupied ourselves by looking for possible traces of other visitors, but found nothing, and clambering about, skirting the cone, we assured ourselves that the mysterious path we had seen a bit below did not lead here. Our aneroids, allowing for compensation, checked 9,780 feet. It was chilly, but not bitter cold. Toward 9:30, after we had been there for half an hour and dared to stay only about a quarter of an hour more, the clouds suddenly began to lift, and what we saw was magnificent. We had come up so gradually from one higher range to another that the little cone on which we stood had seemed nothing more at the last than a casual knoll, and it was startling, when the clouds opened, to find ourselves standing on the top of the world. Great blue ranges and jagged peaks lay far below us. Beyond them, southward, shimmered the Caribbean, and far northwest the misty expanse of the Atlantic Ocean. Northeastward in the green Dominican plains was set, like a small inland sea, the salt lake of Enriquillo, and beyond it, facing us, massed in the sky, the great interior Cordillera range of the Dominican Republic. Less than a quarter of a mile away, and connected with 2, we inscribed the date, our names, the altitude as registered by the aneroids, enclosed the writing in a metal tube, and buried it under a pile of stones beside the geodetic plaque, leaving also a heavy staff protruding from the top of the stone mound. On my return to Haiti in February 1928, Captain Presley and I flew over Morne La Selle, and circling close within 50 feet of the summit, observed the staff and stone mound undisturbed as we had left them. The figures I give from memory, probably wrong. MORNELASELLE Adventure 265 us by a dipping ridge, was an eminence, only about 100 yards lower than the summit on which we stood, and which looked as if it would afford an even better view of the Haitian plain below. We decided to leave the summit immediately and use the remainder of our scant time exploring that other eminence. Barker said, I bet that's where the path led, I bet we find it there. And so we did. We found the path narrow, faint, yet clearly worn as if it had been used intermittently for many years. It led up straight to the brow, where we found a table rock overhanging a cliff, dominating the whole plain of the cul-de-sac, indeed the whole of Haiti northward. My God, what a spot, what a view, cried Parsons. Yes, and look here, called Barker. Guess this settles it. On a great flat stone at our right on the cliff's edge were the black, unmistakable traces of a huge bonfire, and in nearby crevices we found charred sticks which Barker examined and cut into with his knife. Some, he estimated, were 2 and 3 years old. At last he found some which he declared were only about 4 months old, perhaps less. This would have dated the last fire there around Christmas, the time of the great annual voodoo sacrifices and ceremonials. Time was pressing. We left the cliff, and shortly before noon arrived at our camp, where we divided the biscuit and cheese, stuffed them in our pockets, drank the last of the water, not more than a gill for each, and began our hurried descent. Going up, it had seemed to me that those of us who lagged most had a doubly hard time of it, for Ekman, pushing ahead and then sitting down for us to catch up, had longer rests. Also, he instinctively chose the best going, and we, out of sight, only in shouting distance behind, and guided by reluctant replies to our shouts, sometimes. 266 TILS winding floundered about and needlessly wasted our energies pushing through bushes, clambering over rocks. So I made up my mind as an act of will to cling to Ekman's heels like a dog until I dropped, and I persuaded Parsons to try to do the same. At first he grudgingly praised us for it, but finally it injured his pride, and I think he deliberately tried to shake us off. I do not mean that he tried to abandon us, but once or twice up slopes or down where the footing was good, he broke into the slouching trot of the peasants. We were hot, thirsty, and miserably tired. Wilson suffered most and Barker least. Ekman apparently didn't suffer at all. In the afternoon we picked up the Saal Trow Trail and used it for an hour or so, then leaving it to follow the Merian Ridge. Toward 5 o'clock it became clear that we had side-slipped down a wrong ravine and were lost, as we had expected we might be. We had also begun to lag and lose time. I was still dogging Ekman's heels, but Parsons had torn the side of his shoe on a rock and developed an abrasion that must have hurt him cruelly, for he limped, and the side of his sock was clotted with blood. Wilson, the heaviest of us, not fat, but sanguine, florid, suffered most from lack of water. His face was congested, and he became feverish from dehydration. We abandoned hope of finding Baydorks that night and followed the ravine, sure that sooner or later we would come to water or a habitation. And at twilight we reached a cool, deep spring bubbling among the rocks from which a little stream flowed downward, and beside it great clusters of mint were growing. We drank, we thrust our arms, our heads and shoulders into it. We absorbed it. We shouted to Wilson and Parsons. Courage came back to us and a sort of elation. We laughed and joked and congratulated ourselves, and even Ekman was gay. Aubrey produced rum in a little leather-covered flask. We put handfuls of mint the cup bottoms which fitted over our army canteens, poured a bit of the rum in each, and filled them up with the cold MORNELASELLE Adventure 267 spring water. After drinking, I carried a refilled cup of this mixture 50 yards back to Parsons, who was limping up. He looked at me with dazed eyes as he drank. He gave Wilson half. Wilson wallowed in the stream, absorbing water through all his pores, and drying our hands, we lighted the last of Barker's cigarettes. We were hungry, but it didn't seem to matter. Trails came up to this spring, but it wouldn't be much use following them in the dark, and we knew that in the morning people would come who could take us to food. We decided to lie the night there and sleep if we could, though Ekman feared it would be too cold for sleep. And then from the westward, apparently just over a ridge less than a mile distant, a drum suddenly began to beat. We supposed it was for a Congo dance or perhaps a religious ceremony, but as I listened to the rhythm, I was soon convinced that it was neither Congo nor voodoo, but a village signal call. Further down the ridge presently came the identical call from another drum, and then, more faintly, the same call from drums farther and farther distant. I ventured a guess, which proved correct, that old author Haiti at Baydorks, fearing we might be lost, had sent out his drummers along the slopes of Merian to guide us. We went over toward the ridge, shouted. There was an answering shout which we followed, and presently we found the man by himself with a drum, sent indeed from Baydorks. He thumped out a rhythm telling that we had been found. A drummer across another ridge took it up, and thus old authority back in Baydorks, 6 miles away, learned that we were safe. As we followed the drummer who now acted as our guide, we presently heard the Congo drums going at a great rate in Baydorks. They were starting a jubilation to celebrate our return. It was pitch dark when we straggled in. Homemade tin lamps and pine torches illumined the yard of old author. 268 TILS winding Haiti's habitation. A dance was in full swing beneath the tunnel which stopped as they all thronged around to welcome us. The old man kissed us all. A big pot of chicken and another of millet were steaming, awaiting us, and a bowl of water, big as a tub, covered with leaves brought fresh from the spring. Somebody tugged at my sleeve. It was my boy Dinah, who patted me shyly, and then pressed into my hand secretly 2 small tomatoes. I wondered why he was so secret about it, whether perhaps he had stolen them. We stuffed ourselves with food, spread out our blankets there on the edge of the yard, and lay down to sleep, if sleep we could, with the whole village crowded their dank ing, the drums going wildly. It was evidently going to be an all-night affair, and since in a way it was in our honour, we could scarcely protest. Aubrey and I, meanwhile, had got quietly, philosophically drunk on clarin, and except for once or twice in the course of the night when dancers stumbled over me or stepped in my face, I slept like a dead man. Next morning we bestowed largesse, bad goodbyes, Ekman remained, to be gone weeks, looking for new plants behind Illyrian, and set off on our fattened, rested horses, stopping across the gorge to give Mammon Lucy news of the neighbours she had never seen but whose dogs and drums she heard at night, and to look at the relics of the old French colonial habitation at Camp Frank. Here once, in a spot as isolated then as it is now, had dwelt slave-owning luxury. That was clear in daylight, but no oral traditions lingered. Whether the owner, like Count Kenskoff on the lower ridge, had been a monster who amused himself by having his yellow mistresses torn by bloodhounds, or a kindly marquis whose slaves had helped him down to Jackmill when the bloody revolution came, to kiss his hand and see him with his family safe aboard a frigate for Fort Royal, no one will ever know. MORNELASELLE Adventure 269, all Mammon Lucy knew was that they called the ruins Magazine, for no reason she could assign. We guessed it was because the only walls still standing were a circular stronghold on a slope behind the gardens, which might have been the powder magazine of a fort, but in all probability it had been a storehouse. There were foundations, still traceable, of an extensive villa, overlooking what had been a terraced rose garden, with scattered bushes still blooming there, a plum orchard, and the avenue of huge chestnut trees which led to it along the ridge. There were ruins also of a big circular cistern. 2 nights later, covered with mud and dried perspiration, unshaved and unwashed for 5 days, we sat on the beer terrace of the German ambassador, tired but well content. Chapter X The Soul of Haiti on the last bright Easter morning, which I spent in Port-au-Prince. This was only a year ago. The Champs de Mars, a fashionable park adjacent to the presidential palace and new government buildings, resembled an untidied battlefield on which scenes of wholesale carnage had been recently enacted. It was impossible to drive through it without swerving to avoid mangled torsos. It was impossible to stroll through it without stepping aside to avoid arms, legs, heads, and other detached fragments of human anatomies. It was impossible also to refrain from smiling, for these mangled remains were not gory. They exuded nothing more dreadful than sawdust, straw, and cotton batting. They were, in fact, life-sized effigies of Judas and Pontius Pilate soldiers, done to death annually by naive mobs bent on avenging at this somewhat late day an event which occurred in Palestine during the reign of Tiberius. My black yard boy Louis, sweet, gentle soul, had come to me on Saturday and begged in his soft Creole AC sense the loan of our garden machete, in order that he might be suitably armed to participate in the pious slaughter. A Judas, he told me, was hiding somewhere in the jungle ravine just behind the house of Colonel Myers, one of our near neighbours. If I listened, he said, I could already hear the crowd howling and beating drums to drive him from cover. Go, Louis, said I, and God go with you. It seemed a sort of neighbourhood duty as well as a devout one. I suggested that he might take also an old Carco sword. The Soul of Haiti 271, which General Telemaque Jumel had given me, but he thought the machete would suffice, and departed, filled, it seemed to me, more with glee than pious zeal. Through Louis' previous kindness, he had taken me earlier in Holy Week to call on an aunt who lived near Bizoton. I had made the acquaintance, so to speak, of one Judas before he had betrayed our Lord and fled to the woods. All the little community had contributed toward his construction. He sat propped in a chair outside the doorway. They had stuffed an old coat, a shirt, and a long pair of trousers with straw, fastened old shoes and cotton gloves, also stuffed to the legs and arms, and had made ingeniously a head of cloth, stuffed with rags with the face painted on it and a pipe stuck in its mouth. They introduced me to this creature very politely. They were rather proud of him. He was Monsieur Judas, and I was expected to shake hands with him. You see, or perhaps you will not see unless you can recall the transcendental logic which controlled the make-believe games you used to play in childhood, that Judas had not yet betrayed Jesus. He was therefore an honored guest in their house, as Peter or Paul might have been. And so their righteous wrath will be all the more justified when they learn on Saturday morning that Judas has turned traitor. Then it is that all the neighbors, armed and shouting, the men with machetes and cockamacaque bludgeons, the women with knives, even more bloodthirsty in their vociferations, invade the habitation where Judas has been a guest, demanding, "Qui ho li? Where is the traitor hiding?" Under the bed they peer if there is a bed, behind doors in closets. I happen to witness this ceremony in city suburbs, where they do have beds and closets, while members of the household aid in the search and make excited suggestions. But nowhere can Judas be found. It seems that he has fled. What really has occurred is that the head of the house has carried him off during the night and hidden. 2J2TILS winding him, usually in some jungle ravine or thicket close on the city's edge. Judas usually takes to the forest as any man would, heeing for his life. But this is not always predictable. A Judas has been known to hide in a boat, in a public garage yard, even under the bandstand in that Champs de Mars, whither so many of them, wherever found, are dragged for execution. So tracking Judas becomes a really exciting game. A group collects, shouting, beating drums, marching in the streets, racing up side alleys, meeting other groups, each intent on finding the Judas planted by its own neighborhood, but nothing loath to find some other Judas and rend him to pieces en passant. Crowds may be heard also crashing and beating through the jungle hillsides. It is rather like an Easter egg hunt on a huge and somewhat mad scale. Saturday morning, after lending Louis the machete and wishing him good hunting, I got into my little car and drove out slowly toward the suburb of Bizoton. I had been told that I should see many Judases dragged along this road. I am sorry now that I didn't go along with Louis instead, for as it turned out I had the bad luck not to see a single Judas at the moment of actual capture. I did see numbers of them, however, being stabbed, hacked and torn to pieces along the roadside, others being dragged into the city at the ends of ropes. It seemed to me that the women were more savage than the men and entered more frenziedly into the mimicry, but this may have been my own illusion, or merely that female voices are naturally more shrill. As a matter of fact, I think it was all somewhat less savage, less gruesome, more good-humoured, than this description might indicate. There were jokes and laughter, comic episodes. There was a conscious element of carnival foolery in it, if you please. There were moments, indeed, when this carnival foolery seemed dominant, particularly back in the Champs de Mars, where I stopped as many other amused sightseers did, both Americans and upper class. The soul of Haiti, 273 Haitians, watching the ludicrous straw-stuffed effigies, some with coconut heads, being ludicrously ripped and buffeted about. When a memory of Gilbert K. Chesterton's mythical president of a mythical Nicaragua popped suddenly into my mind, as I sat there in the car, I was not immediately conscious precisely why it had popped into my mind. This mythical character occurs in the prologue to the Napoleon of Notting Hill. He is an old gentleman who strolls down the Strand in a top hat and gaiters, but with his body draped in cheesecloth, green and white. From passers-by he inquires where he may buy a strip of red cheesecloth, and they find him comic. But when he gashes his breast with a penknife, dyes a part of the white cheesecloth with his blood, and marches onward, they find him no longer comic but rather a figure which inspires awe. It was, however, only because I was slow thinking that I did not realize immediately the precise reason why this had popped into my mind. There in the sunshine before me stood the palace of the late Guillaume Sam. Beside it stood the French legation in its walled garden, and there also in the sunshine, howling and dancing and brandishing their machetes, now ludicrous and harmless, was the same identical crowd, the populace of Port-au-Prince, which only in 1915 had invaded those buildings, shouting, "Qui bd li? Where is he hiding?" Just as they had shouted in search of these comic effigies of Judas, looking under beds, in closets, just as they had looked this morning for a straw-stuffed dummy, and finding President Guillaume Sam, the man of flesh and blood, had tossed him over the wall, torn him limb from limb, and dragged his mangled torso at the end of a rope through this same Champs de Mars, just as they were dragging the comic effigies of Judas now. And it seemed to me that during this last generation at least, perhaps even in the older days when more gigantic figures loomed, that the Haitian people, so far as their 274 TILS winding politics and revolution were concerned, were somewhat comparable to Chesterton's mythical symbolic figure. The whole Guillaume Sam episode, for instance, which ended in blood, anarchy and American intervention, began as opera bouffe comedy, and for months ran its normal comic opera course. In the late fall of 1914, Davilma Theodore made himself president in Port-au-Prince, and made also the mistake of sending one of his generals, Guillaume Sam, north to the Cape. In less than 3 months, Sam, after private consultations with the notables of the north, announced that Theodore's election was illegal, proclaimed himself protector of the liberties of the people, sent out to Fort Libert, which is a seaside jungle village east of the city of Cap Haitian, and there organized a revolutionary army consisting of some 1,000 generals and 200 privates. I recently visited Fort Libert with a man named Pettigrew, who is clearing the jungle thereabouts to plant sisal. While rambling along the desolate shore to see the old Spanish fortifications, we came upon a brass cannon, still upright on its ancient worm-eaten wooden carriage, and Pettigrew, who knows something about guns, said, "Look here, somebody has been firing this piece, look at the powder stains. How the devil could that be?" With us was one of Pettigrew's barefoot black overseers, who explained proudly, "I myself am the man who shot it. I was Guillaume Sam's commander of artillery." He patted the green rusted antiquity which pointed immovably askew out to sea in the general direction of New York or Labrador, and continued, "Yes, with this I fought valiantly for the Revolution. With this great cannon which you see I shot 9 rounds. Pettigrew said, "What in the name of God were you shooting at?" "But oh," the pained late commander of Guillaume Sam's artillery replied, "you do not understand these. The soul of Haiti 275 matters. It was not to shoot at anything. It was for the capture of the town of Terrier Rouge. You see, they could hear the noise there." And it was more or less thus, for the several hundredth time, that the revolutionary army moved on, and the city of Cap Haitian fell. The government troops fired 3 musket volleys over the heads of the triumphantly entering army of the protector of the liberties of the people, fell back without casualties, sent a telegram to Theodore's Minister of War down in Port-au-Prince, announcing that they had suffered a bloody defeat, and joined the army of the protector. From this point onward, these Haitian revolutions proceed habitually by fixed rules, somewhat like a game of checkers. The protector of the liberties of the people, with an increasingly augmented ragtag and bobtail army, marches southward, liberating various villages, and camping presently before the important commercial city of Gonaives, generally defended by a government army. The German and Syrian merchants of the town come out and beg the besiegers not to burn it. Once or twice, purely through mutual misunderstanding, a part of the city has been burned, but usually the matter is arranged without arson or bloodshed in a manner profitable to the new protector of liberties, and his troops receive their first pay. Thence they march upon St. Mark, which is connected with Port-au-Prince, the capital, by a railroad line. As they approach the St. Mark railroad head, predictable events are also happening in Port-au-Prince. The Minister of War calls on the President and says, "Excellency, this is awful." "How awful?" asks His Excellency. "Well, perhaps with $100,000, replies the Minister of War. The Minister of Finance is called in. When they learn from him what government funds they can grab in a hurry, they vote it in a lump to maintain the government. It may be as much as $200,000. TILS winding 276. Most of this they put aside privately for emergencies. A little of it is given to the army, which entrains northward. The generals of this defensive army, having received their pay in advance, put up a harmless demonstration and retire on Port-au-Prince, announcing that all is lost. At this point, as the liberators are clambering aboard trains at St. Mark, it is customary for the President, the Minister of War, and the Minister of Finance, taking with them the emergency funds, to sail for Jamaica. When the liberator of the people arrives, therefore, in Port-au-Prince, there is no argument. He finds the palace empty, swept, ready and waiting for his occupancy, and a few days later he is elected president. It is an almost ironclad rule of the game that he mustn't loot or burn in Port-au-Prince. That wouldn't do at all. And this, more or less, is the manner in which Guillaume Sam made himself president in March 1915, and he also, in the normal course of events, might have ended his role in the oft-repeated comedy by sailing in his turn for Jamaica. But on certain occasions much rarer, by the way than detractors of Haiti have led the world to believe, these comic opera revolutions have got out of hand and turned to bloody tragedy. This is inevitable in a land where the mass of the populace, possessing childlike traits often naive and lovable as well as laughable, have also a powerful underlying streak of primitive, atavistic savagery, and Guillaume Sam himself was a black Negro of the people. Only 6 presidents in the entire Republican history of Haiti have been assassinated, a record proportionately not much worse than our own, but distinguished from our methods by a certain hearty largeness of gesture somewhat shocking to the Anglo-Saxon mind, as when in 1912 they blew up President Leconte with dynamite, including his palace, his little grandson, and most of his bodyguard. What happened in the case of Guillaume Sam, reduced? The dark mother of mysteries, the soul of Haiti 277 to its essentials, is current history. I should scarcely be including it in this narrative, which pretends no concern with either politics or history, except that it seems to help picture so adequately the emotions and psychology of the Haitians, which I am concerned in presenting, for good or bad, as honestly and truly as I may. And I do believe that there is basic truth, not a mere trick of perhaps picturesque analogy. In this comparison I have been trying to establish between Chesterton's mythical symbolic gentleman on the Strand and the Haitian people. They are habitually a little comic, a little childish, a little ludicrous. They are easily vulnerable to a certain sort of caricature, like Tartarin and the French meridionals. Then suddenly from time to time something that is essential in the colour and texture of their souls, essential perhaps too in the colour and texture of their skins, something more than atavistic savagery, but which may trace none the less to their ancestral Africa, dark mother of mysteries, some quality surges to the surface of group or individual. And when this happens, we others are in the presence of a thing shorn of all that can provoke superior smiles or scorn, a thing which strikes terror and sometimes awe. In March 1915, President Guillaume Sam was installed ephemerally in the palace, and by early summer another self-constituted protector of the liberties of the people was already organizing a revolution in the north, just as Sam himself had plotted the overthrow of his predecessor. The situation contained similar comic elements. It should normally have ended with the envoy so repeatedly written after the names of ephemeral Haitian presidents that the Haitians themselves have come to realize the humor of the phrase as a political epitaph. He sailed for Jamaica. But now comedy turned to bloody earnest. There were numerous tangled contributory causes. The real break came, however, when President Sam learned that a group of politicians allied with the socially important aristocracy of Porto Tils winding 278 prints were plotting to betray him. Encamped outside the city were numerous bands of carcos. Carco is an old Spanish word, meaning a bird of prey that swoops suddenly and flies away. In Haiti it has come to mean the roving guerrilla bands which fight or loot for profit. Sometimes they are revolutionists, sometimes patriots, sometimes plain bandits. They will defend a president or aid in his overthrow, as the case may be. President Sam learned that certain frock-coated gentlemen in his capital were secretly treating with these armed bands encamped in the nearby hills. Immediately he made 2 daring, risky and potentially savage countermoves. First he sent his own soldiers through the city, arresting representative members of the aristocracy and throwing them into prison. Next he sent messengers out into the hills to summon secretly the leader of the largest Carco band, a general named Matelius. And on the following night this Carco chief, by President Sam's own invitation, marched into the capital with his ragamuffin, rum, drinking, machete-waving horde to build their campfires in the very shadow of the palace walls. It was a sight that must have struck immediate terror to the hearts of the fashionable mulatto ladies, whose fathers and husbands had already been dragged away to prison, and who from the luxurious galleries of their richly furnished villas could now see those Carco campfires burning so close to the palace that they could be there only by Sam's own orders. Nearly 200 leading citizens of Port-au-Prince had been herded into the prison. They were all fathers whose bands, brothers chosen from the rich, the socially elite, chosen regardless of whether as individuals they were suspected of participating in the plots against Guillaume Sam. He believed that people of their group were about to betray him, so he seized the group as hostage for his own safety. And on that selfsame night, Sam wrote a letter to Charles Oscar, commandant at the prison. The letter was ambig, one derivation doubtful, and quite possibly wrong. WBS. The soul of Haiti 279 US. Sam was an ignorant peasant who wrote French badly, but it seemed to mean, and apparently Oscar took it to mean, that if Sam were attacked in the palace, he should kill the hostages. Sam was so fearful of treachery that he meanwhile disarmed all but a few of his own palace guards, some of whom were former household servants of the men he had thrown into prison, and entrusted his safety entirely to the Carcos. At 4 o'clock that morning, inevitably, hell broke loose in Port-au-Prince. Charles Dalvar, who survived the subsequent events and happens at this present writing to be mayor, crept down a deep ravine behind the palace with some 20 or 30 friends who had escaped Sam's dragnet. They were armed as such men would be, with fancy shotguns and sporting rifles. Dalvar himself had the silver-chased Lefebvre hammerless, which to this day remains the FL-nest light fowling piece in Haiti. These gentlemen, so singularly armed for such a desperate business, appeared suddenly at the palace gates and began firing. The Carcos, who could easily have repelled and slaughtered them, offered no resistance, but hot-footed it back to the hills, apparently under the impression that the whole city had arisen. The capital has never been a healthy place for Carcos. As Dalvar and his men entered the palace yard, President Sam darted from the palace and leapt like an ape, clambering over the high stone garden wall to seek refuge in the French legation immediately adjacent. He was shot in the buttock as he rolled over the top, and dropped, not badly wounded, in the French legation grounds, whither Dalvar and his men, aware of international law, made no effort to pursue him. But meanwhile, a thing which Dalvar did not then know. Commandant Oscar, hearing gunfire from the direction of the palace, had carried out complete and bloody reprisal in the prison. The massacre was started with rifles, but it was finished with machetes. Later the next day, when the wives and mothers of the Haitian capital went to the prison, 28 trails winding in their fine carriages to claim their dead, they had to carry the remains away in baskets. At dawn, when news of the prison massacre ran through Port-au-Prince, the entire city really rose, and there were no social distinctions in the rising. Aristocracy and populace demanded the heart's blood of Guillaume Sam. A great mob on the following morning gathered in the Champs de Mars before the gates of the French legation, and by some curious psychology that mob was for the moment part-tint as a bloodthirsty tiger. The mob squatted like a patient monster licking its chops in anticipation, while 4 gentlemen of Port-au-Prince, whose names have been by common consent forgotten, appeared before the tall grilled gate of the legation, meticulously garbed as if for a formal morning call, and discreetly sounded the little bell which tinkled in the far interior. Perhaps Guillaume Sam, guest of the legation, heard that faint, discreet sound of the little tinkling bell. The French minister answered in person. I am told that he recognized the 4 callers and that he immediately opened the grilled gate. It would scarcely be polite to parley with such courteous visitors through a grating. It would perhaps also indicate that there was something to conceal. I am told that his young daughter stood beside him. I am told that he said, "Gentlemen, will you come in?" I am told that they doffed their hats to Mademoiselle and thanked him gravely, but remained standing just outside the gate while they explained their errand. I am told that the French minister lied like a gentleman and said, "He is no longer here." I am told that they also lied like gentlemen, saying, "Sir, we believe you. Your word is enough for us, but unfortunately it will not suffice for the populace. It is better that we should enter discreetly and verify the fact than that they should enter to search." "I must warn you," said the minister, "that either course, the soul of Haiti 281 would be equally a violation, which I am compelled by law and duty to forbid." "We regret it," said the 4 gentlemen. "Unfortunately," replied the minister, "I have not the armed force at my command to prevent you." Guillaume Sam had been well hidden, but one thing had been overlooked. His wound had been dressed with iodoform, and they nosed him out as the Danish soldiers in Ha. Illit did the body of Polonius hidden behind the arras at Elsinore. He offered no resistance until they were descending the staircase, and then his bodily courage snapped. One of those 4 gentlemen with whom I have talked many times tells me he believes that Sam never lost his moral courage or his mental intent to march bravely down that stairway to his certain death, but he could not control his automatic muscular reactions. His thick peasant hands gripped the heavy wooden balustrade, and offering resistance of no other sort, he clung to it for dear life. Sam was a powerful black Negro of the people, a brute in physical strength. It would have been impossible for those 4 men to dislodge him without a regrettable and undignified struggle, and above all things they wished no struggle, no disorder inside the legation. They whispered for a moment. One finally lifted his hands, palm outward, in a shrugging hopeless Latin gesture of acquiescence, and nodded to a second who raised his heavy, gold-headed cane and broke Sam's arms above the wrists. Arriving in the garden, they did a strange thing. They avoided the gate over which hung the French consular coat of arms. It may have been Latin Negroid theatricalism. It may have been something finer. But at any rate, they avoided the gate. They lifted the president in their arms and threw him over the wall to the mob outside. The mob, of course, simply tore him into pieces. Mostly they used their hands, but one woman cut off his head with a machete and marched with it. Another woman, they say. 282 TILS winding ripped out his heart and marched, tearing it to shreds with her teeth. Ropes were fastened to the torso, and it was dragged through the streets. Meanwhile, Charles Oscar, commandant of the prison, had sought refuge in the Dominican legation. He had apparently been forgotten by the mob, but he had not been forgotten by a certain grey-haired, quiet, dapper little coloured gentleman whose 3 grown sons had been among the victims of the prison massacre. This little gentleman donned his long-tailed coat with its tiny red ribbon of the French Légion d'honneur, and his lemon-yellow gloves of the old boulevardier. Some Americans now in Haiti find material for derisive amusement in old gentlemen of his sort, and called upon the Dominican legation. I am told that he sent in his card. I am told that Charles Oscar, who was a cruel man but not a coward, entered the drawing-room with a nervous smile. Be those things as they may, the little old gentleman shot him carefully 3 times through the heart, 1 bullet for each of his dead sons. At the precise hour when these events were occurring, the American battleship Washington was steaming into the harbour. More than 12 years have passed, and the Americans have been in Haiti continuously ever since. The prise en serve of the Americans